So thank you for that introduction. Today I'm going to be talking about my research, Arctic cod, how that relates to sustainability, and how sustainability relates to us all. So to give you a background on my study subject, this is the Arctic cod. It is a small planktivorous species of fish, which means it feeds on plankton. And as the name suggests, it is found in the circumpolar Arctic, which is just a fancy way of saying above the Arctic Circle. They're pretty small. They only get up to like 9.5 inches in length, and I think they're pretty cute. But outside of their outward appearance, they're also a very interesting type of fish. Here they're denoted as polar cod. That's just the European name, still the same fish. But they are a crucial intermediary species in the blue web. So Arctic cod feed on zooplankton, and in turn, Arctic cod are fed on by everything else. So whales, belugas, bowheads, narwhals, other species of fish, seals, seabirds, and then even massive predators like polar bears that don't feed on it directly, feed on it indirectly because it feeds on all these other things. So basically, they are a very important fish to the food web, a very important middleman that transfers energy from the lowest trophic levels, zooplankton, to the highest trophic levels. They're an extremely dense energy source, which is pretty rare in the Arctic given how cold the temperatures are. And in some regions, they facilitate up to 70% of this energy transfer from the lower trophic levels to the higher ones. And this is a bit of foreshadowing, but if there were to be any disruptions in their populations or in their distributions, this would have really negative cascading effects on the rest of the ecosystem. So specifically what I'm studying are Arctic cod gill rakers, which are these little things right here. They are cone-like structures that are found on the inside of their throats, and they trap prey. So when they're swimming along and water is flowing over their gills, their gill rakers will capture the plankton that they feed on and push it back into their throats. And something that we found with research is that when young, gill rakers and Arctic cod are very densely packed in order to capture small baby plankton. But as Arctic cod grow and move into deeper waters, their gill rakers space out in order to capture larger and more mature plankton. And why this is important is that basically we assume that they have associated their gill raker traits with the life cycle of their prey. So they're very specific to Arctic zooplankton life cycles in order to capture and feed on them efficiently. So that's all great. Why does it matter? Basically, the world is heating up, and so are the waters, especially in the Arctic. It's a region that is warming 4 times faster than other places on Earth. And this means that Arctic zooplankton that are very specific to cold waters are now being forced out, meaning that Arctic cod, who feed on them, need to adapt their gill rakers in order to capture new or different prey. So, my research is using genetic tools to investigate how gill rakers develop and how they change. So I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with genetics, but it's basically everything that instructs you. Your hair color, your eye color, your skin color, and that's the same for all living things on Earth. So I'm going to be looking at what genes are responsible for changes in Arctic cod gill rakers, when and how. And I've condensed this into a few research questions, the first being which genes are involved in gill raker changes? At what stage of development are they expressed? And again, another kind of concept, gene expression, you can imagine it as genes, as kind of like a light switch or a light dimmer. You can turn genes up, down, on or off. So when you were a child and you were growing, your growth genes were turned on way more than they are now. And in gill rakers, we expect to see the same thing. We expect to see higher gene expression when they're younger. And then this information can help us figure out if it's an adaptive trait. So can gill rakers change throughout their life in response to the environment? And knowing these things are important because it would help us understand Arctic cod's resilience in a changing world. It would help us identify vulnerable populations, whether that be by age of Arctic cod or distribution. And this would help us improve predictive models for ecosystem changes. So because Arctic cod are so important in the middle of the food web there, if they disappear, we can assume, or if they shift even, we can assume that that will affect the predators that prey on them. And then this will also help us direct conservation policies. Basically, also, the Arctic now, there's inevitable change with climate change. We can't really stop it at this point, so we need to focus our priority on resilience and mitigation of negative impacts. And this kind of brings me to the idea of sustainability. So when you think of this word, you might think of an environment in disarray, glaciers melting, species disappearing. And while this is a somewhat accurate kind of idea of a lack of sustainability, the idea of sustainability includes many other concepts like economic stability, community health, and food security. And this brings me to northern communities. This is particularly relevant to them. And sustainability is tied to food sovereignty, public health, and although Arctic cod play an indirect role here, they're a crucial tie in order to maintain the predators that northern communities rely on for subsistence harvesting. So stuff like seals, polar bears, other species of fish that all feed on Arctic cod are harvested by these northern communities for several things, specifically for food. So disruptions in Arctic cod populations could indirectly increase reliance on imported goods, and I don't know how familiar you guys are with the prices of food up north, but I've seen a thing of grapes go for like $50. In Nunavut, I think 80% of the population relies on country food, which is essentially anything they've harvested, hunted, fished. So if these things disappear, there's an issue there. It would also undermine harvesting economies. They sell the things that they harvest, and it would increase food insecurity for the reasons I described. It would also weaken their economic autonomy because a lot of the artisanal industries rely on pelts from seals, bones from whales, things like that. And all those things are incredibly important, but it's also very important to understand that cultural continuity or cultural sustainability will be affected by ecological health and ecological sustainability. Hunting, fishing, trapping, these are all practices that have been performed for eons. They're core to community identity, intergenerational knowledge transfer, language transfer, social cohesion, and it's also a spiritual practice. Disruptions in Arctic cod populations could result in a loss or decrease in all of these things, as well as self-determined food systems and fewer youth opportunities to engage in their culture, which has already been so affected by colonialism. So, with this broader context, we can see that sustainability is, in fact, an environmental issue, but it's also a profound cultural and social challenge. So, what do? It's very important that because of how quickly and unprecedentedly climate change is changing our environments, we need flexible and responsive governance in order to address these issues. Management policies historically have been guided by historical baselines, so things like storms, we had kind of a metric for how many would happen, at what magnitude, and those types of things have all changed. Ocean acidification, ocean temperatures, they're all changing at unprecedented rates. So an example of failure where we had inputs coming from scientific communities and other communities as well, such as northern communities, are coral bleaching. This has happened all around the world. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. That's a healthy coral, that's an unhealthy coral. This happens due to ocean acidification and ocean warming. And failure in governments has resulted in these events happening all over the world, which results in loss of biodiversity. Coastline protection, as they offer structural protection as well. Tourism and small-scale fisheries. And at the bottom here, these are Atlantic cod, which are a commercially important species of fish. And in the 1990s, their populations completely crashed. Governments like the ones in Canada, the ones in Greenland and Sweden put a moratorium on fisheries, meaning you weren't allowed to fish any Atlantic cod. And although in the short term this hurt the fisheries that relied on them, these numbers were able to bounce back, and this is a recent picture of commercial fisheries of Atlantic cod. However, off the coast of Maine in the US, governments did not put a moratorium on, and they have never rebounded. So Maine and also these coral bleaching events are an example of what happens when we have this fixed governance. So the path forward, sustainability in a global and northern context is now based on more of fostering resilience in environments and communities. Again, these frameworks for managing natural resources must be equally dynamic as the changes we're seeing around us. And scientific inquiry is required. That's kind of where the stuff that I do comes in. Although I'm not directly answering any of these questions, we're uncovering how ecological systems function and respond to change so that that information can be used to inform practices and policies that will help sustain thriving environments and communities for now and also generations to come. Thank you.